I would like to start out by thanking the Barr Foundation for a grant that helped us put this program together and this entire series together. I'd also like to thank our partner organizations who have been co-sponsoring this. They include the Trustees, the Mount Auburn Cemetery, the Emerald Necklace Conservancy, the Leventhal Center at the Boston Public Library, and DCR through the state. Finally, I would like to thank Keith Morgan, Bree Harvey, and especially Bill Clendaniel, who all helped us plan and put together this series. As we've often said, many of our best ideas come from suggestions from people who just stop by and say, we have this great idea. This entire series really came because Bill stopped by and said he had an idea. Bill will be moderating this program and will introduce the rest of the speakers, but I have the pleasure of introducing Bill. Bill was a trustee of the Mass Historical Society for many years, serving as chair for one period of time. He majored in history at Williams College and continued his studies at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He served as an officer on a destroyer during the Vietnam War and then graduated from Harvard Law School. For 9 years, he was the deputy director of the Trustees of Reservations and then was the president and CEO of Mount Auburn Cemetery for 20 years. So he has some background for our panel. He has also served as the trustee of Historic New England and currently is treasurer of the Friends of the Public Garden in Boston. So he comes to us tonight with a lifetime of work in private land preservation effort. It was his idea to have this series of programs highlighting the important role that Massachusetts has played in land preservation for nearly 400 years. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Gavin. I didn't just drop in, I was a member of the program committee. And, I looked back at my minutes, and it was about a year and a half ago that we first started talking about this. So for me, it's wonderful that we're actually all here, and thank you for coming. This evening is the first of 3 sessions dealing with the important role that Massachusetts has played in our national history regarding the preservation of open space for the public. Our session tonight will largely focus on private efforts, while the next session on April 25th will focus on the efforts of public agencies. Finally, on May 2nd, the final session will deal with the future, where Massachusetts is going with respect to open space preservation. One of the themes of this session will be how the public's perception of the importance of open space has changed over the centuries. We're really talking about nearly 400 years here. Throughout the series, you will learn how influential Massachusetts has been on both the national and international stage. We have a very distinguished panel of professionals tonight, all deeply involved with both the history and current management of significant pieces of Massachusetts landscape. All 3 are also fellows of the Society. Starting to my left, Jim Levitt is director of the program on conservation innovation at the Harvard Forest and associate director for land conservation programs at the Lincoln Institute of Public Policy. A graduate of Yale College, he also has a master's degree in public and private management from the Yale School of Management. Prior to coming to Harvard and the Lincoln Institute, Jim spent nearly 2 decades in the private sector as a management consultant and renewable energy project developer. For the past 20 years, he has focused broadly on historic and present-day innovation in the field of land conservation and is currently helping to organize 2 networks for sharing best practices in land conservation. The International Land Conservation Network, which promotes civic sector action in land conservation on 6 continents, and Alpine, Academics for Land Protection in New England. Jim is also a trustee of Mount Auburn Cemetery. Next is Meg Winslow, a graduate of Carleton College, and since 1995, the curator of historical collections at Mount Auburn Cemetery. She is responsible for collecting, protecting, and providing access to the cemetery's extensive archives, library, photographs, and large objects collection of fine and decorative arts. She also provides guidelines for the care of the cemetery's outdoor collection of significant artistic memorials and stained glass. She is a vital member of the extensive preservation team at Mount Auburn. She co-authored The Art of Commemoration and America's First Rural Cemetery, Mount Auburn's Significant Monuments Collection. Meg is an active participant in the many ongoing discussions among preservation professionals from museums and other conservation organizations in the Boston area, and has written and lectured widely on these issues. She continues her long-standing work as a private art advisor and curator to significant art collectors. Finally, Cindy Brockway, a graduate of the University of Rhode Island in horticulture and the holder of a master's degree from Boston University in Preservation Studies, has been program director for cultural resources at the Trustees of Reservations since 2011. She leads a team of cultural resource specialists at the Trustees seeking innovative preservation solutions for the many historic sites and gardens owned by the Trustees. Prior to joining the Trustees, Cindy ran her own landscape preservation consulting firm for 25 years. She is the author of A Favorite Place of Resort for Strangers, Gardens of the New Republic, and has work featured in Old House Journal, Victoria Magazine, Colonial Homes, 19th Century, and other publications. Jim will begin our story in the early 17th century, discussing the preservation of Boston Common and later private efforts to expand open space preservation. Meg will pick up the thread with the early 19th century movement to create Mount Auburn Cemetery and how its establishment influenced landscape efforts across North America. She will explain how the cemetery's mission of preservation has changed over the years. Jim will return briefly to discuss additional private initiatives in the mid to late 19th century, and then Cindy will tell the story of the Trustees of Reservations, beginning in the late 19th century, its worldwide influence, and its continuing work up to the present. I will then pose a few questions, and after a bit of back and forth, we will open the floor to you for your questions and comments. We look forward to your participation. If you wish to speak, please leave your seat and come to the microphone. Is that what we're going to do tonight? So that everyone can hear you. Jim.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here with all of you to see the great turnout tonight and to be sitting, frankly, next to Bill Clendaniel, who has a remarkable reputation as a scholar and a professional in this field. Bill, thank you so much for inviting me. I had the honor in January of this year to hitch a ride on a propeller plane to Chacabuco, Chile, where a woman named Christine Tompkins finalized the gift of 1 million acres of private land to the government of Chile, and her gift was answered with 9 million acres dedicated by the government of Chile to new national parks. It was a historic event. Chris Tompkins wrote in the New York Times shortly thereafter that what she had done was an act of democracy. She was exactly right. In fact, the idea of citizens protecting open space for the public good grew up in the same time, in the same place, less than 2 miles from here, that local democracy was invented in the modern world, in Boston. Indeed, rather than the understanding of most Americans that conservation was invented by Teddy Roosevelt in 1900, or maybe by Olmsted in 1860, this is a tradition, as Bill said, that goes back 400 years. To the early freemen or their magistrates, we're not quite sure who voted, in 1634, the head of household men in Boston had the opportunity to buy from Reverend William Blackstone about 50 acres of land. This is because Blackstone, who had taken the oath of loyalty to Winthrop and his party, decided that he wanted to move to Rhode Island and study his books in peace. The townspeople of Boston, these men, voted to tax themselves to raise the money to buy this open space, 6 shillings per household, more for larger households. This is, by the way, exactly what the Community Preservation Act in Massachusetts does today. By voluntary vote, it taxes homeowners so that we can protect open space. This land in the first proto-democracy, in the English-speaking world at least, was something that was created by the people, for the people. It is of the people. It was a creation of the citizens, and the citizens came over the next 150 years through the American Revolution to see it as a birthright, to see it as something that belonged not just to the city or the town actually at that time, but to the people who lived in Boston. There was a proposal in 1799 to build a gun house on the Common. An armory was eventually built and then disassembled. But in 1799, there was perhaps the first public environmental protest in the United States, in the English-speaking world perhaps, when posted on trees around the Boston Common was a document that is little known, but I think will become much better known in the future. It reads, "Citizens, you are this day called to determine upon a subject of vast importance to you and to your posterity. The wise policy and good judgment of our forefathers selected a spot in the southwest and west part of town, open to cooling breezes and necessary to relieve the heat of a sultry summer, to be forever held sacred to the safety and health of themselves and their children to the latest ages." These are the people who fought the Revolutionary War, who were fighting to protect their open space. Now, I have 2 Confederates to my left who will read the end of this particular broadside. Meg, you first.
Friends and fellow citizens, attend the town meeting this day and there prove that you are worthy offspring of your great progenitors, that you cannot be guilty of this base and degrading crime of ingratitude towards them, and that your feelings as fathers will never allow you to deprive your children of the blessing which your fathers transmitted to you. Your souls would revolt at a charge of theft, of larceny. Commit not then a robbery, which would only be a less crime than sacrilege. And
resolve that from the principles of justice, gratitude, and parental affection, you will never, never suffer a building from a palace to a gun house to be placed upon that devoted spot, the Common.
25th September 1799. So never ever let a New Yorker tell you that Central Park was the first park. Now, the civic leaders of Boston in about 1810 had the idea that they would erect an equestrian statue of George Washington on the Common to commemorate the father of our country. These men included, over several iterations, Edward Everett, Daniel Webster, and others. They were beat to the punch by the people of Baltimore, Maryland, who built a tower with a statue of Washington on top of it. But that urge to inspire patriotic fervor on our public spaces was an important driver in the drive to protect land for the public good. Many of these same Bostonians, especially Edward Everett, who you will hear about later from Meg, went on in 1824 to organize the Bunker Hill Monument Association. It was not at that time a national park. There were no national parks in the United States. It was rather a private association of citizens who collected the funds by 1825 to buy 15 acres of land on top of what we call Bunker Hill, which is actually Breed's Hill. This is perhaps the first time that we know of, at least in Massachusetts, that citizens went out to buy land as private citizens for the public benefit. A little twist on that Boston Common tradition. In later days, and Bill, I'm almost finished, in later days, in the 1830s, when the Bunker Hill Monument Association had not raised enough money to build their obelisk, they mortgaged that land and eventually had to sell it. Amos Lawrence wrote the following: "The Bunker Hill field is above price. The time will come, if it is left open, when it will be the most interesting spot in this country, perhaps the most interesting spot in any country, and will exert a high moral and political influence upon posterity. Can we of the present day in any other way appropriate $25,000 so much to their advantage? What man in this city who received an inheritance from his fathers wishes his money had been increased by the sale of 50 years ago of our beautiful common? Is not his inheritance increased in value by its being left open 100 times the amount it would have sold for?" So this sentiment among our leading citizens that protecting open space for the public benefit was deep and held in a very heartfelt way. Meg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Bill, and thank you, Cindy. I'm delighted to be in this company. And also to the Massachusetts Historical Society for your invaluable endeavors to enhance understanding of our nation's history. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Well, in a few short 20 minutes, I'm going to give you a glimpse into how a group of citizens got together to create a private enterprise to solve a problem. In the process, they created an enduring landscape and a green space that became a model throughout the country, Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's a story worth remembering because it reminds us of our future. This is, in fact, a great segue from Jim's talk because Mount Auburn's 3 founders were active participants in the Bunker Hill Monument Project. Henry A.S. Dearborn was a member of the Bunker Hill Monument Association and in charge of the committee on the monument. George Watson Brimmer submitted a design for the monument, and Dr. Jacob Bigelow was brought in along with the poet and painter Washington Alston to advise on the design of the monument. It was in 1825, the same year that he submitted his obelisk design for the Bunker Hill Monument, that George Watson Brimmer purchased a picturesque, gorgeous tract of land bordering Cambridge and Watertown, which in only 6 short years would become Boston's new burial ground, Mount Auburn Cemetery. George Brimmer is one of our heroes. He bought the land from the Stone family, early settlers of Watertown, not only because he thought it was so beautiful, but because he wanted to protect the ancient trees that he loved from development. The stands of venerable oak and beech from being torn down. He wanted to preserve from encroaching development the site's varied topography, the deep circular dell and the mount at its highest point, 125 feet overlooking the Charles River, 4 miles west of Boston. I'm curious, who's been to Mount Auburn? So you know it. Has anyone not been to Mount Auburn? Founded in 1831, Mount Auburn is our country's first rural cemetery, a tranquil and beautiful place outside of the city of Boston, an organic union of art and horticulture where family and friends are buried and commemorated with tasteful sculpture and memorials. It's the first designed landscape open to the public in North America and a national historic landmark. There are very few landscapes that are national historic landmarks. Last year, in 2017, there were 211 designated landscapes out of approximately 2,500 landmarks. Still, an active cemetery nearly 200 years after its founding, Mount Auburn is non-denominational and non-sectarian, open to all, to everyone, free of charge, dawn to dusk, 365 days of the year, 175 acres of great natural beauty. The cemetery is a historic landscape designed and shaped by generations of Bostonians. A landscape where nature meets art, past meets present, and life meets death. Today, there are more than 100,000 individuals, whom we call residents, buried and commemorated in these sacred grounds. More than 200,000 visitors come through a year, and several turkeys. Can you see a turkey in the foreground? And as arboretum, botanical garden, wildlife habitat, and museum without walls, to our visitors, the cemetery sometimes looks so much like a park that they forget that Mount Auburn and the rural cemeteries modeled after it were precursors to our public park system. When Mount Auburn was established in 1831, the great architect of Boston's Emerald Necklace, Frederick Law Olmsted, was a mere boy. He was 9. He was a boy in breeches. So Mount Auburn is one of the larger green spaces in urban metro Boston, but it is different from a park. As the cemetery continues to evolve into the 21st century, it's being rediscovered for its complex cultural history and for its pivotal significance in the history of landscape design. In the 1820s, our city had a burial crisis. Bostonians were disturbed by overcrowding in the quickly growing city, dismayed by the condition of their urban burial grounds, and anxious to find their own final resting places. Droves of people were moving in from the country to find work in the city, and there was a kind of nostalgia and romanticism for the rural landscape of the country. Dr. Jacob Bigelow, a visionary physician, spearheaded the citizen effort, extolling the harmonious face of nature and its resuscitating influence. The solution was to find a burial space outside of the city, thus the term rural cemetery, but their effort was delayed. The challenge was in actually securing attractive land. Concurrently, Henry A.S. Dearborn, founding president of the new and energetic Massachusetts Horticultural Society, was trying to raise funds of his own. He had his own project, an experimental garden with the purpose of improving the art and practice of horticulture. When Jacob Bigelow joined the Horticultural Society as corresponding secretary, amazingly, the two men joined forces. Do you know this story? Am I telling you what you already know? Dearborn and Bigelow merged their two cherished projects into one that they could both get behind, a place of burial outside of the city with a garden of experiment. The whole thing came together when Bigelow's college friend, George Watson Brimmer, offered his Watertown property at cost to the Young Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Dearborn visited the site, heartily approved, and a new American landscape was born. It was an inspired and practical solution. By linking burial and commemoration with a garden, by placing the grave in the garden, Bigelow, Dearborn, and Brimmer transformed American death practices. As it still does today, the new cemetery provided permanent burial in a large-scale landscape, in a rural setting outside of the city, in nature, in a picturesque landscape designed to look like a picture, with permanent family lots, and it would be open to everyone right from the beginning, non-sectarian and non-profit. It was a practical solution with a strong aesthetic component, a design inspired by Père Lachaise Cemetery outside of Paris and English landscape gardens, laid out by Dearborn, whom today we would call the cemetery's landscape architect, with the surveyor, Alexander Wadsworth. People came and they loved it. The Prince of Wales, Edward VII, the Emperor of Brazil, Emily Dickinson, who wrote a poem, Emerson and Longfellow wrote in their journals. Within 15 years, 9 major cemeteries were patterned after Mount Auburn. And incredibly, by 1865, there were more than 75 cemeteries, rural cemeteries, across the country. But why was it so popular? The American view of death was undergoing a dramatic change. The word cemetery itself connoted sleeping chamber or resting place, a striking contrast to the Puritan imagery of skull and crossbones in Boston's burying grounds. And there was great civic pride that Jim was talking about, great civic pride for this young nation, 50 years old. By erecting permanent monuments to citizens of Boston, we were remembering not to ignore the past. We would remember our history and teach our children. It all made such good sense. But more importantly, there was a response to growth in the cities. Mount Auburn provided access to nature to all citizens, a kind of romantic retreat from the cemetery. Remember, this was way before public parks. Central Park in New York wasn't established until 1857. But we did have the common. Indeed. I think this is what was most surprising about Mount Auburn, its focus on the living as much as on the dead, on teaching our country's history, but on providing solace through nature, using a graceful, beautifully designed landscape. Another important point about Mount Auburn is that from the beginning, its founders, Bigelow, Dearborn, Edward Everett, and the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, its founders were aware that the land was precious and that burial space wouldn't be available forever, and they discussed right away at the outset putting money aside to maintain the landscape for the time when there would be no more burials. As one of the early nonprofit organizations in Massachusetts, Bigelow and Dearborn were skillfully managing large tracts of land, of real estate, with new buildings and management, finances, and record keeping. Under their guidance, Mount Auburn would become a long-lasting cultural institution like the Massachusetts Historical Society for families for generations to come. Rural and garden cemeteries can't be underestimated in terms of their value in protecting green space in urban areas and in their potential to maintain and create beautiful landscapes and gardens for the public. Mount Auburn's 175 acres include valuable natural resources, trees and shrubs, habitat for birds and wildlife, sculpture and works of art, and architecture. In order to ensure the preservation of the cemetery's historic character and maintain the beauty and inspirational qualities of the landscape, Mount Auburn's mission of preservation has grown dramatically to include ambitious projects of monument conservation, historic landscape improvements, and preservation of our historic archives. These preservation efforts also include strategies to provide sound environmental stewardship by protecting soil, water, wildlife, and habitat. Birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish, mammals, and insects fill important niches in harmony with our plants and horticulture collections. Today, we are embracing our landscape as a green oasis in an urban environment by evolving into a living laboratory for biodiversity research and citizen science activities. This type of continuing study and conservation will help ensure that a healthy landscape will endure well into the future. Every day at Mount Auburn, I come to truly appreciate that the rural cemetery is one of the most innovative institutions invented in the 19th century. Mount Auburn and the rural cemeteries it inspired transformed our American cities by providing green spaces and designed landscapes that were open and available to the public. It was the inspired result of a group of Bostonians who got together to solve a problem in our city. It was a practical solution that was so much more, a multifunctional landscape designed for the living and the dead that changed our understanding of what a cemetery could be. As an important Boston institution, Mount Auburn continues to change and grow, yet it retains its mission of being a site of natural beauty for burial and remembrance. It's one of the most exquisite landscapes I know. Thank you. Cindy. Oh, Jim, not Cindy.
Just it briefly comes back to me to make a couple of points. One is I want to underscore what Meg just said about these ideas being innovations. If you think about open space, there are 5 attributes that can be used to think about whether or not something is truly innovative. Is it novel, reflecting creativity in its creation? Is it strategically significant to the practice of protecting open spaces? Is it measurably effective? Is it transferable? And will it endure? Mount Auburn actually fits all 5 of those criteria beautifully. I know as a trustee of Mount Auburn that it endures to this day, and there are institutions, not just in the United States, but all over the world, that continue to study it and copy its example. The other note I want to make that's very important for us to say in the early 21st century is that in about 1840, the ladies started to come on very strong in this movement. It was the ladies who raised the money through fairs to complete the Bunker Hill Monument, with encouragement from their husbands and their male friends, but they really led the charge. It was also the ladies who, in another part of the country, founded the Mount Vernon Ladies Association that might be the first single site land trust in the world, but not a regional land trust. I have to say that it's very important, though, for Bostonians to realize that 1/3 of the money for Mount Vernon's protection was raised by the same Edward Everett who was there trying to put the monument on the Common, who was there at Bunker Hill, who wrote the circulars that raised the money for Mount Auburn, and who later dedicated the cemetery at Gettysburg and was billed as the author of the actual Gettysburg Address. President Lincoln's, of course, is the one that's endured. Now, the spirit in Boston to protect landscapes for the public good just kept rolling on. 8 years, I believe, after Mount Auburn Cemetery was founded, a group of private citizens led by Horace Gray leased some newly made land at the foot of the Boston Common to create one of the first botanical gardens in the United States. It is today known as the Boston Public Garden. It is a public garden today, but in its first 25 years, even though it had that name, it was actually a nonprofit institution. And it was called, the people who ran it were called the Trustees of the Public Garden. So even that nomenclature has antecedents that go back 50 or 60 years before Charles Eliot had his great idea that we'll hear about in just a second. Another example, and there are very many examples that start rolling in right about the time of the American Civil War, that's important in Boston is the Arnold Arboretum, which was actually the brainchild of a gentleman named George Burrell Emerson, who was Ralph Waldo's cousin and the foremost expert about the trees of Massachusetts. He wrote a volume that was hailed in its time as a botanical masterpiece. That, again, is a private institution, Harvard University, making an open space that's open to the public. It actually is city land, but I believe it's leased for, Bill, how many?
999 years.
999 years, so it'll be around still for a while.
Probably down to, what, 900
Yeah.
years now.
About 900, I think, that's right. But again, a public good that was established, was created, was brought into this world by private citizens or private institutions. And so we begin to see national parks, we begin to see a lot of things, but there are no regional associations that protect systems of open space, private institutions protecting it for the public good, and that's where Cindy's story comes in.
Like everybody else, I'm thrilled to be able to be here and thrilled to be able to tell this story about the trustees. I think if any of you have been to some of our properties, have some of you been, I hope? There's 116, so hopefully there's a chance for you all to get to see at least one in your lifetime. I really am grateful for the Mass Historical Society and with this incredible panel, and to be able to really think about this combination of private entities, public open space, and linking people with some amazing, incredible landscapes. We really are very lucky here in Massachusetts to have the resources that we have so close to so many of our urban areas. So very quickly, I want to be able to walk through a little bit about the history of the trustees. And for this organization, it is very hard to separate the early years of the trustees from Charles Eliot. The trustees really was his brainchild, but it came out of him being a student of the world, I think. And that is part of the reason why the trustees has such a broad mission and a broad encompassing purpose for being here. The thing about Charles Eliot is that he went to Harvard. His father was president eventually, went there, sort of was okay with academics, but really didn't want it. What he wanted to do was wander. And so even in 1878, while he's a student at Harvard, he publishes a little diary about these walks that you can take on a Saturday around the city of Boston. And so being able to go out, experience the wilderness, experience what's happening around him, and get into the wilds of the Boston area is really what he wanted to do. There was no training for landscape architects at the time. He wanted to be able to learn how to be able to shape these landscapes. And so, like all good sons of good academicians, you head to Europe to go see what's going on over there. He took some horticulture classes at the Bussey Institute, which is the only thing that was available to him then. And then later, with his friendship with Frederick Law Olmsted, you begin to see the development of this landscape architecture department at Harvard, particularly after the death of Charles Eliot. He only lived 37 years years. And sometimes I wonder if he's a little bit like John Kennedy, that he died young, had these great visions, and so his visions far surpass his lifetime, but he becomes more of a hero because he did so much in such a short period of time. I can't talk about the trustees without talking about this year that he spent in Europe and what he went to go see. Spent a lot of time in London. It was dreary, it was winter. He went to the British Museum and the British libraries and read books about landscape architecture, and then traveled to go see those places. And you would think that most of the places he went to see were in England, but instead he put together a trip that took him almost as far as Russia and then down to southern Italy, and looking specifically at studying landscapes and understanding what they were all about. While he was there, he met with some conservationists that were very influential in his life and also in the establishment of the bylaws for the trustees. In particular, he went up to the Lakes region and saw Canon Hardwick Rawnsley, who had been working on the defense of the Lake District and the Lake District Defense Association, the Lakeland Defense Association, in trying to stop the coming of the railroad up into that region and turning a lot of the valley areas into reservoirs for water that would draw more people up into the district. So they had a series of bylaws that they actually put together, and when Charles Eliot went to go visit with Rawnsley up at Allen Bank, he handed them to him and he said, you know, we can't get this going here. There's not a way that we can get these bylaws in place to form this nonprofit entity right now. So maybe they'll do you some good. And so he brought those back here with him. He also traveled to the German-Poland border and went and saw this estate property, really village, entire design village called Muskau, that was the genius of Hermann von Puchler. And while he'd been at the British Museum, he'd read in German Puchler's writing about landscape architecture and landscape design. And we really don't do enough, except Keith Morgan wrote a beautiful article about the influence of this designed landscape in Germany on Eliot and on Eliot's travels. And what Eliot loved about the place was that he combined the beauty of an industrial village with a grand schloss and a beautiful landscape that was naturally there into something that was so comprehensively composite beautiful that it really looked at the broader division of landscape. It wasn't just a design around a beautiful schloss, it was really the entire community that was designed into this. And you can see the influence of that as he starts to shape what the trustees is going to become and the role that preserving landscapes in the larger definition of the word would be. When he comes back, he opens his own practice, and one of his favorite walks was to go out to Belmont and walk where the Waverly Oaks were. So he writes an article for Garden and Forest, who his friend Charles Brake Sargent is editing, and talks about, the name of the article was The Waverly Oaks, a Plan for Their Preservation for the People, because there was conversation about actually cutting down what he called these aboriginal trees. And he makes this wonderful phrase that I love to use all the time about what the trustees is all about, and that is, why can't we form an organization that holds land reserved for the public enjoyment, just like a museum holds pictures or a library holds books? And so that is where the name, the Trustees of Reservations, comes from. It's this reserved land, but it really is a collection of places that are set aside for the public good that he's building. So out of that article and out of a lot of very smart maneuvering and gathering all the right people in the right place, they formed this organization called the Trustees of Reservations in 1891. And this is our mission even to this day. And I call it the three-legged stool. We have a four-legged stool now because we have farms that are a major part of our work. But this is setting aside land of scenic, historic, and ecological value in Massachusetts. He called it historic, scenic, and natural areas. And now we add our farms into that as well. But it was this idea that you could have these different kinds of landscapes, all equally important and all equally influential, and really having people enjoy getting out into the wilds and getting out into beautiful spaces not very far from where they were. Now, this is a long slide with a lot of text, so you don't have to read it, but if you ever want to form your own nonprofit, look at the way that this organization was organized. Eliot was very smart in who he put together. So the first thing he did was he got the Massachusetts senator to be part of his steering committee, known as the living symbol of the dominant Republican Party. So you always have to have a good politician. William Steele Shurtleff was actually a man of the people. He came from the Springfield area, and he was interested in these same kind of walks that Eliot was taking. So getting out and looking at natural areas and preserving special spaces, especially in the Connecticut River Valley. So he's branching out beyond Boston. Philip Chase was another more local politician that really helped and was very influential in the eventual establishment of the Metropolitan District Commission. And Eliot really was looking at two kinds of entities at the same time. One was this, what is now known as a nonprofit entity, a private entity, and the other was what was possible with local politicians and through political efforts to establish something that essentially created a larger park system in and around the entire metropolitan district of Boston that became known as the Metropolitan District Commission. He had a horticulturist on his team, and he also had this geologist, but the geologist came from a place in Martha's Vineyard known as Seven Gables Farm, which is still there today, and it was probably one of the first limited developments that set aside land for farmland and rural agriculture, as well as building in summer houses for fancy people to live on Martha's Vineyard. Still there, and actually a very interesting planning effort that you can see Charles Eliot looking at and saying, you know, this is another way for us to be able to set aside some public open space, but also have private land development happening at the same time. So very early conversations around these things. As I said before, for Eliot, landscape meant the visible surroundings all around us on the surface of the earth, so a very broad definition. And he set out these 5 categories of spaces that he thought this fledgling organization should really start to begin to look at. And as he was beginning to assemble land, now there was no money, he didn't have a lot of wealthy folks, even though some did have some money. He was really looking at political connections, connections to the people, and then trying to be able to build an organization that could accept these pieces of land. He wanted to think about space on the ocean front. There was a lot of conversation around the limited access that folks were having and that was diminishing to the ocean front and the coastline of Massachusetts. The shores and the islands of the bay, the courses of large tidal estuaries, and these were not what we consider to be the tidal estuary today, the marshlands and so forth as the river meets the sea, but instead they were the entire course of a river. And some of this may have come out of his work that he had done as an intern in the Olmsted office for a while, because Frederick Law Olmsted always looked at the river lands and the buffers to rivers as being natural open spaces that could not be developed, and so became important parts of the park systems that he developed in and around major metropolitan cities. Also, Eliot felt that it was important to get pieces of forest that were on the rim of inhabited areas so that you could get to the wilder wilderness and be able to access that kind of a landscape experience. And then the 5th was small squares in the midst of dense populations. And I have to say, out of all of these categories, that is the last place that the trustees came to when they started looking at the kinds of collections of landscapes we should be getting. So the first property that is given to the trustees, and I was telling somebody earlier, this is a board that was all Bostonian men that was established to start this organization, but it was the women that gave them the land that they started to protect. And often it was in honor of a beloved family member that had passed. So the first property was Virginia Woods in Stoneham, and it eventually went over and was transferred to the Metropolitan District Commission and became part of a larger network that we now know as the Middlesex Fells. The Rocky Narrows is still one of our reservations here, and if you look at a map of the trustees' reservations, you'll see a number of smaller parcels all the way up the Charles River that were assembled and gathered together that we now manage as open space along that river. Lots of great canoeing out of those spaces. The first wild forest on the rim of an inhabited area we collected was Mount Anne in Gloucester, and unfortunately it's the one place that you really can't get to today because when 128 came in, it took the parking lot for Mount Anne. The land is still there and it's still wonderful habitat space for us, but it is not as accessible as our other places are to the public. Governor Hutchinson's Field was probably the first historic place that we were given, and that was in 1898 again. This last vestige of the old colonial governor's seat came to us, and still a beautiful view back to Boston today from Milton. Now, they were given these small parcels of land, and then there's a big period of time when we did not acquire any new land. But being a landscape architect, and with Charles Eliot passing, another new generation coming into the organization, they wanted to comprehensively look at both what was available and also what was in public trust for landscapes across the entire state. And so there's two very important reports that come out in the early 20th century. One is the Province Lands Report, this real concern about the lands on Cape Cod and their protection. And the other was the public holdings of shore towns all around Massachusetts, and trying to understand exactly how much open space was available for people to get to the beach. In 1925, the study that was done called The Needs and Uses of Open Space in Massachusetts was the first time there was a cooperative agency conference to look at both private and publicly held lands and try to address that inventory across the entire state, and then come up with a list of the kinds of landscapes that we should be looking at as priority lands to begin to acquire. So they're defining the characteristics of what should be preserved, and also identifying wildlife sanctuaries and state forest areas and things. We still have the maps for all of this as well. Our archives are really quite wonderful when it comes to conservation history, including Charles Eliot's scrapbook that gathered every article and every little bit of information as the trustees is being formed and the MDC is being formed around these early thinking around conservation. In fact, most of our acquisition of land and the planning work that we've done and the management work that we do is all based out of that 1925 study. And it's a study that was redone in the 1970s. And then another study, the landscape survey in Massachusetts, was done, but during the WPA, it was another project to put folks to work. And then again revisited in the late 20th century. So some of these ideas really took hold and stayed as guiding documents for not only us as an organization, but for the state of Massachusetts in both the public and private sector in land conservation work. Today, just a quick glimpse at what the trustees is all about. You can see that these strong roots that were formed in 1891 around these various areas and types of landscapes to be reserved really did flower into what is today the Trustees of Reservations. Believe it or not, we protect 26,000 acres of land, and we're only in Massachusetts. We are not a New England-based agency. 14,000 of those acres are in conservation restrictions, so still held by private individuals, but protected as open space, not publicly accessible, but still protected open space, which becomes critical for habitat use. We own more of the coast of Massachusetts than any private entity in the state. And so this is now, under our new strategic plan, one of the areas that we're really looking to understand what's happening with the Massachusetts coast and the changes with climate and so forth. All the miles of hiking trails we have, the ecology program that we run, the rare species habitat that we protect becomes core. We own the only national natural landmark, which is Bartholomew's Cobble out in the Sheffield Great Barrington area, which is a special designation, a little bit like national landmarks for historic designation, but for ecological areas. Our farmland, lots of farmland. And the one place that I can find where we started to gather in small community squares and urban areas is this affiliation with the Boston Natural Areas Network and the 60 community gardens that they held that are now part of our operation at the Trustees. Our cultural resources include designed landscapes, lots of archaeological and industrial sites that now have become romantic ruins on some of the hiking trails through our properties, and 7 National Historic Landmarks. 3 of those are landscapes. Lots of buildings and lots of roofs to take care of as well. Our latest iteration of the different types of properties that we have as we start to bucket them together in different ways to really drive our stewardship includes the public gardens work. And I had the hardest time convincing some of our board committees of the definition of a public garden, because they all said, well, we already have the public garden. It's in Boston. We can't do anything with public gardens here in the state, but globally, this is more what the public gardens are known for. We also hold a lot of archives and objects and wonderful, wonderful historic resources. So I really encourage all of you to come and visit our Archives and Research Center for any kinds of research that you want to do in and around Massachusetts. We probably have something there that's of interest to you. The legacy of the trustees is really, truly remarkable. So coming out of this one man's vision, forming a very influential group of individuals that could really establish this organization, get its bylaws adopted, get it recognized by the state of Massachusetts as a legal entity, and then move it forward for more than 125 years, has resulted in a series of other organizational heirs, we like to call them. Probably the most famous one is the National Trust of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland that was founded 4 years after the trustees was founded. That bylaws that came from the Lakes District back to us and then went back to England and formed the National Trust there was one of our favored children. The Metropolitan District Commission, as I mentioned, was founded about the same time. But then out of this founding of the National Trust came the National Trust of Scotland, the Land Trust Alliance that we're still very actively involved in, and then the National Trust in England fostered the development of an organization called INTO, which is an international organization of national trusts. And I met the director of that organization at a conference on climate change, and he said, you know, we always look at the trustees as the perfect model of how other countries can begin to build a trust that includes ecological and historic and scenic lands together under a private entity. The other precedent-setting private conservation organizations that we haven't talked about here tonight, but I just wanted to mention, one is the Laurel Hill Association out in Stockbridge that was founded in 1853, another woman-founded organization for town improvements, and then the Massachusetts Audubon Society in 1896 and the Harvard Forest in 1907. Again, remarkable organizations of their own that are also equally important in thinking about this private land trust entity. Our leadership in the 20th century continues. In 1952, the trustees modeled this new way of managing recreational spaces at Crane Beach, where the management of the habitat and the ecological habitat that's there was as important as the public access to the beach. And it still continues to be one of our challenges today as we stop overland sand permits on Martha's Vineyard while the plovers are nesting and folks are frustrated that they can't go fishing in their cars when the plovers are out there in their way. But still becomes an important way of us being able to manage our ecological, especially sensitive ecological species or endangered species. The Land Conservation Trust, what you see in the 20th century with the trustees is the beginning of different ways of us being able to quickly protect land that is threatened and coming up with different vehicles for us to be able to do that beyond being given something as a straight gift, looking at other legal ways of partnering with other agencies or coming up with fast cash that allow us to step in and hold some land until its final future is determined. And the Land Conservation Trust, which is an affiliate of the trustees, does that. It's basically a revolving loan fund for conservation work that happens. And it became the Farms and Conservation Land Trust in the 1980s when there was a lot of farmland that was threatened. Our hunting program was the first I believe, in the private and the public park entity. We had so much overpopulation of deer at Crane, on the Crane Estate and at Crane's Beach, that it was threatening the health of the herd. And so we began a controlled hunting program that we've now spread to some of our other properties, and a way of both recognizing the value of deer in the ecosystem, but also the damage that overpopulation can cause when those herd numbers are not controlled. And finally, in the 1970s, this conservation restriction program was begun as another way of being able to provide for the opportunity for preserving open space, even when properties remain in private hands and are not accessible to the public, but yet the habitat and the landscape can be preserved from overdevelopment. Our latest reservation that we've just acquired 2 years ago now is Fruitland Museum out in Harvard. It holds all of these entities that are part of the trustees' mission. So incredible scenery, important historic and cultural stories, wonderful archaeological sites, and a rich opportunity for ecological management, especially for grassland birds and grassland habitats. So again, a real rich history of a remarkable organization, very broad and very far-reaching in both its vision and its scope and its legacy. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I think it's very appropriate to mention, since we're sitting here in one of the nation's preeminent archives, that we could have not have told this story 10 or 15 years ago. Both the Trustees of Reservations and Mount Auburn have developed these amazing archival centers. And we are able to tell these stories now in a way, and have people like Jim, who I think is working on a book on some of the things that he's been talking about. He has resources that were not available a few years ago. As someone who started in this field in 1979, it's very gratifying to see the incredible progress that is being made. Another comment I want to make, I want to also mention another organization, Historic New England, which was founded early in the 20th century and focused primarily on buildings. But over the years, and in my time with them, came to really look much more closely at their landscapes. When I worked at the Trustees of Reservations and afterwards, I was always complaining that everybody was just looking at the open space and they weren't paying attention to the historic resources. And I was asked to address the staff at one point after I'd left, and I said, you know, all those docents in the houses are looking out at those landscapes, and all the people in the landscapes are looking in at the house, and it's really all part of the same thing. And of course, that's what the English National Trust does so well. But the Trustees of Reservations is doing a much better job on the house side, largely through efforts of Cindy, and I think Historic New England is doing more on looking at their incredible open space resources. So I would say, having listened to all of this, that we should feel very proud of our state and the people that came before us, and I think we can feel comforted that things have not stopped. They're changing, growing. But a question I have that I think is interesting to ask is, why do you think Massachusetts was so much a originator of this idea of public open space? Why Boston? A lot of this was focused, of course, in Boston. Any thoughts on that?
I have one, but
Go ahead.
I think it actually has to do with the fact that democracy and the protection of open space was created by the very same people. And that they had in their mind that we live in a commonwealth where some of the resources that support our livelihoods and our lives and the things that we love are common resources, are resources for the public to enjoy. Actually, the one thing I want to add to Cindy's talk is that the first name of her organization was the Trustees of Public Reservations, even though it was a private organization, because there's been a reformist tradition in Massachusetts since John Winthrop wrote about the city on the hill that says we can do things in a new way, in a different way, and we can make them better for all of us. And so Massachusetts is a natural place for the land conservation movement to have grown up.
You know, it's interesting. We do a lot of looking at the genealogies of a lot of our properties, including folks that have been at the property for numbers and numbers of generations, sometimes in the same family, sometimes they get sold back and forth. But the one common denominator that comes out of a number of our places is a link to Harvard in one way or another. And I do think that this idea of writing, creating a vision, creating a belief, and then building a constituency around it is something that all of these organizations have in common. And a lot of that comes out of some of this academic tradition of a college that was started so early here right in Boston. And we do come from a community of writers and inspirational writers that take a lot of their inspiration from the landscape around them. And I do believe that that's a part of this. And I think even with the Puritans coming in, writing to talk about this land of wealth and this land of plenty and encouraging others to come over, even if it was for the progenitoration of the Puritan lifestyle, is a way of really talking about that. Northern New England, when I do a lot of work up there, it's all about exploiting natural resources. And there certainly was some of that here in Massachusetts, but it's a very different story and a different history with the religion and the academia here than what you see. And in Rhode Island, it's all about the freedom of many different peoples sharing those natural resources together in one place. Much more about the freedom and the rights of freedom here in America coming out of Rhode Island. So it is a special spot where some of these things come together, I think, here in Boston.
Another thing that occurs to me is that I know in the case of Jacob Bigelow and some of the other people, they had grown up in the country, and they had come to Boston to make their fortune or pursue academic pursuits, and they missed the country as Boston began to develop. Whether we can say that Boston became more urbanized faster than other American cities, I don't know. But there was that strong feeling. And, you know, when you think today how urban we've become and how many of our children and grandchildren are growing up in cities and don't have this rural upbringing, it makes it all the more important, and I know this is an important thing to the trustees, that we get youngsters out in nature, because that's how they're going to understand these places and how important they are to preserve them in the future. I think we're you know, at the moment we're a little under threat in that area. I think the pendulum has swung, and maybe here in Massachusetts, we're going to have to make sure it doesn't swing too far. Other comments you want to make before we open this up? Or?
One more. The threat to open spaces and these places we love is far from over. This isn't just a historical tale. Right now, we are bolting towards a future where the public garden will be below the tide. That is, or at least below storm levels, and where much of downtown Boston is threatened by climate change. So all of these places that we're so proud of are going to need us to stand up for them right now. This is not a story that ends with Charles Eliot. It's a story where a new chapter begins with us.
Well, and I can speak, since I'm involved with the Friends of the Public Garden, before climate change inundates the garden, I think development is going to also overshadow it, that it will be a very different place.
Indeed. Yeah.
Mount Auburn, I think, is less threatened in that respect, and certainly many of the properties of the trustees are still very rural, but certainly climate change is a major impact. Well, you've been very patient and listened to a lot of words and hopefully enjoyed a few pictures, but if there are any comments, questions, we'd appreciate it. Russ.
Thank you. I'm a Massachusetts native, and I'm very proud of all the wonderful and leadership work that's happened in Massachusetts open space. But I'd like to point out an example that we haven't really caught up with yet, and that's the natural burial parks. This is a concept that started in England and has now come over to the US. There's a great example outside of Ithaca, New York, called the Green Springs Natural Cemetery. If you go to naturalburial.org, that's their website. And two land trusts in Massachusetts, the Mount Graceland Conservation Trust and the Essex County Greenbelt Association, have been meeting with two groups, the Eastern Mass Funeral Consumers Alliance and the Western Mass Funeral Consumers Alliance, to try to set up a natural burial park in Massachusetts. So if this is a subject that interests you, I hope that you'll contact any of those groups. To me, I think it's the ultimate act of somebody that cares for the environment to see their remains go to one of these natural burial parks. And it's a great way to support land conservation, too.
A little bit of history. Gordon Abbott, of course, was a longtime director of the Trustees of Reservations when I was there, and also a trustee of Mount Auburn. And when I went to Mount Auburn, he was remained on the board, and we looked at this issue. It's developed a lot since then, but we actually went out and looked at some land in Sudbury that eventually, fortunately, I think went to the Sudbury Valley trustees. Could Mount Auburn save another piece of land? And we concluded that all we would be doing would be competing with ourselves, so we dropped that idea.
I'd like to respond to that. There we go. Natural burial is directly tied to land conservation, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Ramsey Creek and the Green Springs that were both created as natural burial sites for the purpose of saving the land. We don't want to develop, there you are, we don't want to develop the land, so therefore we're going to make it into a cemetery for natural burial. And you know, at Mount Auburn, we didn't have to save the land. George Brimmer did it for us. But natural burial is a wonderful way to go to minimize your carbon footprint and leave as little behind as possible. A whole nother great subject.
And Mount Auburn has been within the constraints of its particular landscape, has been looking at how we can accommodate this. I say we, I'm 10 years out of, but I know this was something we talked about, and I think it's
Yes.
been
and-
continuing discussions.
Mhm.
Yes, sir.
For 60 years, I've focused upon immersion into the Emerald Necklace and with the life and works of Frederick Olmsted. And paradoxically, I think we should, since his 200th anniversary is coming up in 5 years, that we focus upon him and have people realize publicly that he was not involved with the Boston Common, nor the public garden, nor the cemetery. And I would like to raise the question that I believe he had tremendous influence on Eliot. We have a terrific opportunity in the next 5 years of making Eliot more known, and also those who came before. So I congratulate all of you, because this was very moving to go back and how it all started.
You're absolutely right that Eliot did go to work for Olmsted. He went as an intern first and then went and did his travels in Europe. And I think it was a combination of his father encouraging him to go and Olmsted. But Olmsted also told Eliot that he was a wonderful writer and a commenter on landscapes, and so that his real talent was in writing and talking about these spaces, and he should never forget to do that. And that is certainly true. We have some wonderful writings that he did through Garden Forest and other places about this idea of land conservation and land work. And both Olmsted and Eliot were wanderers. They wandered and they looked at the school of landscape that was at their feet. They didn't learn it through academics as much as they did by actually going and looking and observing and writing and commenting on where they were and what they were seeing. So sometimes if I take folks on a landscape tour, we talk about it as a three-dimensional textbook, and we talk about those themes that flow through the landscape and how you can read those as you wander through. And what we can do for our young people is to get them to think about some of these places that way and question and ask why that ruin is there, why that river is there, why that old house foundation is there, and why that pet cemetery, which is another thing. We are actually in the cemetery business because we have a lot of pet cemeteries on our properties. But honestly, I think it's true that there's some parallels in different generations between Olmsted and Eliot in many ways.
Olmsted himself had a mentor, or somebody who influenced him in a very important way, named Andrew Jackson Downing. Downing went to England before Olmsted. Olmsted had a bad habit which is he pretended that he invented the idea of conservation at Central Park. And New Yorkers continue to bring that idea into the world repeatedly. He was a great man, and he founded the profession of landscape architecture in the United States. I believe that's true. But as we revisit Olmsted's life, we ought to do it in the context of the many, many people who came before him.
I would just add 2 points. The firm of Olmsted did 3 family lots at Mount Auburn, but because the complicated history of Mount Auburn is collaborative and difficult to tell, that so many people assume that Olmsted designed it, which he did not. But he was cremated at Mount Auburn. My second point is, come and visit the grave of Charles Eliot, who is buried at Mount Auburn.
Bingo.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
About the Boston Common that we were listening to at the beginning of this talk. Of course, I love the place like everyone else does, but I wonder if the Puritans that early in Boston really conceived of it as a park, and that they could, maybe it's a misconception of mine, that a place that for people to relax and sit around in and enjoy the sunshine, or was it more in the sense of a piece of land that belonged to everybody, you know, for people to bring their cows and all that stuff? Was it really a park in our sense of the word?
It was, but it was also an agricultural resource. It was the cows that lived in Boston ate grass on the Boston Common and gave the families milk. It was a place where people cleaned their carpets. It had many purposes, but I forget the guy's name, but Willis, I want to say. As early as the 1850s and 60s, English observers of Boston were writing home and observing how the young gallants were taking their marmoset madams out for a promenade on the Boston Common as early certainly as 1860s. Now, marmoset madam, lest we be confused, would mean sweetheart today, not something else. But nonetheless, it was certainly a recreational resource and a place where the people of Boston celebrated great victories in the French and Indian War, after the Revolution, but many things in the early 1700s. So that's another misnomer, is that it didn't become a park until 1822, when the cows were banned from the common. That's simply just not the case.
You need to write your book, Jim.
Thank you for clearing up a misconception.
Sure.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This is a fascinating talk. And kind of coming off this last question, what I really appreciate tonight was how you all highlighted the multifaceted and overlapping meanings and uses of open space and conserved land in Massachusetts and elsewhere, from these sort of more utilitarian landscapes of the common to recreational landscapes to historic sites and now sort of ecological preserves. Thinking about tonight's theme and topic of private land conservation, I was wondering if you three of you could speak to the management structures of private land conservation. What makes it easier or what makes it harder for these private organizations to balance these competing, sometimes mutually supportive land uses in contrast to sort of public organizations and so on? So what is it about these sort of, again, private organizations that makes, again, it easier or harder to balance these uses? Thank you.
Well, I could certainly speak to that, having, in a sense, managed both Mount Auburn and, in a sense, a lot of the trustees of reservations, because I was responsible for all the property management. One thing that springs to mind, again, particularly because now I'm involved with the Friends of the Public Garden, I thank my lucky stars that when I was working, I didn't have to deal with a governmental partner. Just the fact that they are private and able to do their own thing within the constraints of laws, of course, and regulations, makes life a whole lot easier. The other point I would say is they're not unionized, and that makes life a lot simpler for people managing institutions. But maybe more importantly, and I see this all the time with my work on all of these organizations, is private philanthropy is much, I think, easier to get if you're a private organization. I can think of an example that I'm dealing with right now at the Friends of the Public Garden, a significant gift that the donor does not want to go to the city of Boston, even though it's going to go for something that in effect is carrying out a purpose of the city of Boston. So they're looking to the Friends of the Public Garden to deal with that, and I'm sure we could all come up with. So those are just 3 ideas anyway.
For the trustees, I think what happens with us is that we're a little more agile because we don't have the politics and the hearings and the public money and the public trust that we have to respond to in a very public forum kind of a way. We certainly have our records, are open for our members and so forth, and we're still a member-held corporation, but we do have a lot more agility to act a little bit quicker. We have a lot more of an ability to be able to gather other agencies and other partners, which is very similar sometimes to the DCR and some of our other public entities that are helping to conserve land. But I do think we're able to pick up the phone, or we're able to assemble what is needed more quickly. And I have to say this revolving fund that we have is another way for us to be able to act fairly quickly, even if it's just to hold a piece of land for a moment until the right structure comes along, whether it's limited development or private conservation restriction or a public, land that's open for the public use and enjoyment for another entity or public entity. We're able to do some of those things which the public agencies can't do.
I think the founders of Mount Auburn were very astute, and they set aside money that created a healthy endowment. But all of us need to increase our culture of philanthropy in order to thrive in the future. It was a very good model, but it's not enough to do what we want to do. In terms of the private-public tension, we did have a story in 1985. Some of you probably know when the fence was taken down along Mount Auburn Street. And that was a very important turning point for Mount Auburn as a private institution to realize that the community, the surrounding public, really cared about what they were doing. And something came of that where the Friends of Mount Auburn was created in 1985 because of what happened there. People said, that's a beautiful fence, please don't take it down. Why didn't you call us for help? Historic New England, which used to be called SPNEA, immediately stepped in and helped, and private citizens, again, I guess it's private, but it was the Cambridge Historical Commission that did the study and did the reports and landmarked the fence and the gateway. So that was a good story, learning about the outside world. Really changed the cemetery for the better.
I'm Ron Fleming. I'm a former trustee of Trustees of Reservations, and my question kind of fits in with that, I think, which is, because you have this agility as organizations and can anticipate things probably better than public agencies, is it possible that in the future, and this is a question for all of you, that you will develop a greater agitprop strategy which will help the public bodies? So the whole idea of growth in Massachusetts and the build-out implications of local zoning are huge, and yet there's no concentrated effort that I've seen to kind of look at the implications of that on the whole society. And we've seen that the private sector of organizations is better funded and better strategically able to think about that problem. So I'm just wondering if that has been one of your concerns. And by the way, the fence was taken down except for one little piece of it.
65 feet to either side of the gateway was restored, and then the rest of it was vinyl covered chain link, but it's not done. There's still hope.
I think you're right. One of the things that I'm discovering in looking at the history of the trustees as an organization is that these land plan studies, these ideas of looking not only where available open space is, but also where we can send our direction for where we want to go in the future for open space, is for both advocacy as well as management or gifting of land in some form or another. We don't have to own it all. We can certainly see it go to other places, is really important. And the last major studies that were done here in Massachusetts were back in the 1980s, so that's almost 40 years ago now. And I do think it's time for another. I have to say that this Community Preservation Act, the idea of that was also born here in Massachusetts, is a really critical opportunity for Massachusetts small communities for saving open space and having some funds to take care of them, which is also the problem in small towns and small communities. And we have benefited from that act and got some funding to steward some of our properties. But I do see that working very well in conserving open space for small communities as well. But nobody's really done some master planning studies for those communities to really strategically look at how that should really come together. So you're right, you're absolutely right. It's another thing that we need to be doing. And we try to act as advocates when problems come up where we can and where we can have some power. We have much more power by acting as part of the Land Trust Coalition, which is a whole range of both small and larger land trust entities that are formed together to really try to promote some of those ideas and some of those thoughts. But sometimes we talk to ourselves and we don't talk to those that we need to be talking to.
It's on a small scale, but one of the chief projects of the Friends of the Public Garden at the moment is holding the city's feet to the fire and doing a planning study of the downtown area. I mean, I'm talking about a very, very small, when you look at the whole Commonwealth, and you're absolutely right, Ron. But that's another private group trying to make sure that we do planning. I think we're all aware that planning in the city of Boston is not what it should be.
One of the most interesting ideas that's emerging out of the land conservation community in the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit sector, the academic sector today is this idea of large landscape conservation. That is, how do we put together mosaics of public land, land trust land, of limited developments, of old religious properties, so that we create corridors of open space that provide lungs for our societies. And both at the Lincoln Institute and at the Harvard Forest, we're focusing on one that's focused right here in New England called Wildlands and Woodlands, the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative, that has the audacious idea that we can protect 50% of the Massachusetts landscape as protected land before the end of the next century. And actually, it's not an intractable problem. It's not an impossible idea. So that idea of finding our public allies and our private allies and our allies in the academy and working together is one that's got a lot of power.
That's a great segue to make sure you come to our second program, which will talk about public agencies. And then the third program will look at some of the things that you've raised, Ron, about the future, particularly in Boston, I believe, in the initiative of the Trustees of Reservations and other organizations. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And thank the panel for coming, and thank you all for joining us this evening.